Well, thank you all very much indeed for coming out this afternoon. I don't know whether you actually feel like this, that the end of all things is at hand. Do you feel like that? Do we think that it feels like the end of all things is very fast coming to a conclusion? Certainly does feel like that to myself as we're watching the things that are happening in the news. And it isn't just the most recent events, is it? We've seen lots and lots of things that we're going to consider this afternoon. This little phrase, of course, comes, as it says there, from 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7. And in this particular chapter, I mean, clearly this was written 2,000 years ago. And you might wonder, did Peter himself think that the end of all things was at hand 2,000 years ago? I don't think he did. But when you read 1 Peter chapter 4, it's talking actually about the future judgment that's going to come on the earth. In 1 Peter 4 verse 12 it says, "The time is come that the judgment must begin at the house of God, and if it first begin at us, what shall be the end of those that obey not the gospel of God?" So in other words, when he says the end of all things is at hand in verse 7, he goes on and basically says, I'm thinking about the time when judgment is going to occur. So clearly at some point the world is going to be judged, and just before the world is going to be judged, it is the end of all things as we know it. Now, when you think about all the things that have been going on in the world over the last number of years, there's been a lot of things. Can you read that, by the way? Yes. Is it coming through all right? I can't see it on the screen very clearly myself. Hopefully you can read what's coming through. We've seemed to have lurched from crisis to crisis, don't you think, over the last number of years? So, you know, back in 2019, we'd never heard of COVID. Well, we just at the back end of 2019 heard about COVID as this far-off disease in a far-off place, China. And then suddenly, before you knew it, it was sweeping across the world like a tsunami almost. And then all of a sudden, pretty much every nation on earth is locked down. And then suddenly we can't leave our homes. And the streets are deserted. And the governments are now sending people furlough cash. Who had heard of furlough before? Like, nobody had heard of furlough. And people are receiving money from the government. And our debt went from this level to this level almost overnight, as if we'd been in a war. And you know something? On the very day that COVID was announced, that it would be that the World Health Organization declared that COVID was no longer a worldwide threat, the very next day, Russia invaded Ukraine. The next day. And that war massively destabilized Europe. The worst conflict in Europe since the Second World War. I don't know quite how, nobody quite knows how many people have been killed in that war, but it's enormous numbers. There's at least 1 million casualties in this particular war, and it shows no sign of abating 4 years later. Then, after that, only a year or so after that, Hamas decide to attack Israel on the 7th of October 2023. And that then sparked off what I call the inner ring war of Israel then fighting pretty much for its life, really, against Hezbollah, against Hamas, against the Houthis, and ultimately the big power behind all of those is, of course, Iran. Then we spiral from that into what we've seen in just the last few weeks is a major war with Iran, a major problem for the entire world. It's quite incredible how quickly it's impacting us, and it's only just begun. And it's everybody's saying, well, how does it actually come to an end? I mean, what brings this to an end? So, and the reason, of course, I've got a lady there in pain is that she is giving birth to a child, and the Bible talks about at the very time of the end, it being like a woman in labour. And one thing I remember from when Angie gave birth to my two daughters was that the contractions came quicker and were more painful. I mean, I'm talking as if I know what she was going through. But I could sort of gauge that they were getting more painful because I was sat watching this screen that monitored the contractions, and I was scoring it out of 100 because the machine scored it out of 100. And I was saying, do you realise that was 88 out of 100? She said, I know it was 88 out of 100. But it's pain. One thing's for certain, once labour has begun, the contractions don't get further apart and easier. There is, of course, the final bit where the contractions have dilated the cervix, and then there's the final push. The final push is the ultimate pain. We're not quite at the final push, but it's reaching the final push. But the pain is underway. And the other thing is, it's very rare to have contractions start, and then the hospital says, don't worry about it, go home. Once it's underway, nothing can stop the process. And I feel, maybe you do as well, that this is where we're at. Nothing's going to stop this process. It is going to end up with the return of Jesus, because ultimately that's what we're told in the Gospel of John, that all these events, are leading to the birth of a child, in symbolic terms, the return of Jesus. And that's, as we've said in our opening prayer, what we're looking for. We're not looking at all these events because we're intrigued and we like to watch war and terrible things. We're watching it, one, because we're told to watch it, two, because why has God told us, if he didn't want us to watch it, it's to prepare ourselves to see Jesus. Now, what we're going to actually do, though, this afternoon is maybe take a tack that you might not be expecting, but this is what we're going to do. We're going to be entirely looking at Isaiah. And I guess if I said to you, give me some prophecy books and maybe some chapters, I don't think Isaiah would be at the top of your list. I reckon you would give me the likes of Ezekiel, Zechariah, Joel, maybe the chapters from the Olivet prophecy, maybe Revelation. I don't think Isaiah would make it maybe into your top 10. But you're going to see something hopefully amazing here, that Isaiah should be in your top 10. And that's what we're going to look at. Now, one thing, that you see on the screen now, I've put there's 10 warnings to the world. And they're what I call national nightmares that Isaiah talks about. And we're going to have a look at these. We're going to actually look at all 10 of these warnings that are in Isaiah. Each one, to be perfectly honest with you, is probably an hour's talk on its own. So I'm going to give you an overview of each of these 10 warnings that are in Isaiah, and hopefully you might go away and look into them a little bit more. But these 10 warnings are the lead up to Armageddon. Now, I just want to say one thing before we start delving into this, and that is this. Some of you are going to sit there, rightly so, and look at some of the prophecies that we're going to look at and say, wait a minute, wasn't that fulfilled 2,500 years ago, or 2,000, or however many years ago? Wasn't that fulfilled in the days of whenever? And I'm probably going to say to you, yes, it was, to an extent. Because all prophecies, pretty much all prophecies, and I'm talking a minuscule number of exceptions to what I'm about to say, I think all prophecies have got a short-term fulfillment, which happens in the days of the prophet himself, or very close to the days of the prophet. And then there's also a long-range fulfillment that often is to do with the last days. And you might say, well, why is that? And the answer to that is quite simply that God arranged it like this so that Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 22 came to pass, which Deuteronomy 28:22 says this: when a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, If the thing follows not and doesn't come to pass, then you know that the prophet has spoken presumptuously and it hasn't come from me. So in other words, God says, I'm going to give the words to the prophet. If what he says happens, you know it's come from me, which is why you've always got short-term fulfillments, because what we're supposed to do, and even the people back in ancient times should do, is say, that prophet's just spoken. And has what he said come true? If it was all long range, you couldn't do that. If it was 1,000 years in the future, how could you determine if the prophet was true or not? So what I'm saying is, when we look at some of these prophecies, your brain will automatically go back to the original fulfillment, and rightly so, because that's the tick in the box to say it was fulfilled to some extent. But I'm also going to show you that in all cases, there are huge clues that it isn't just short term, that there's long-term elements. And I'm going to show you the ones that we're going to look at tonight. Every last one of them has got a long-range fulfillment, which is playing out right now, as far as I can see it. All happy with that? We got more people coming in. I'm going to pause just a second. Here we go. Right. So here is what we're going to look at. Where are we starting? What we're going to be doing is looking at these burden messages to the nations, which begin in Isaiah chapter 13 and go all the way up to Isaiah 23. And there are 10 burdens. There's the burden of Babylon, the burden of Moab, the burden of Damascus, the burden of Ethiopia or Cush, depending on your version that you've got, the burden of Egypt, the burden of the desert of the sea, the burden of Duma, the burden of Arabia, the burden of the valley of vision, and the burden of Tyre. And we're going to look at all these. And they're absolutely incredibly significant, as we're going to see as we go through these things. Just before we start looking at these burdensome messages from God, I just want to show you the chapter that comes at the end of these burdens. So basically, there's the 10 burdens. And as you see, we go from Isaiah 13 up to Isaiah 23. Anybody want to tell me what comes after Isaiah 23? Isaiah 24. Come on, this is it. It's Isaiah 24. This is Isaiah chapter 24. We will go through this in a bit more detail if we've got time at the very end. I'm sort of showing you the end at the beginning to show you where the burdens lead up to. The burdens lead up to the judgment of the entire world. I don't know if you want to open your Bibles at Isaiah chapter 24. In my Bible, and I know we've all got different versions and different Bibles in terms of translations, but in my authorized version Bible here, it's got at the beginning of chapter 24 as a heading, God's judgment on the whole earth. That's what my Bible is headed up, God's judgment of the whole earth. It says in verse 1, behold, the Lord makes the earth empty, he makes it waste, he turns it upside down, he scatters abroad the inhabitants. It also talks about utter and complete financial collapse of the earth. In verse 2, it talks about it shall be as with the people, so with the priest, as with the servant, so with his master, as with the maid, so with the mistress. Have a look at this. As with the buyer, so with the seller. As with the lender, so with the borrower. As with the taker of interest, so with the giver of interest or usury, it says in my version, to him. So it basically said, it doesn't matter if you're a banker or a borrower, you are all in the same position when God judges the earth. I don't think it is that the people who are borrowing suddenly become very, very rich and match the wealth of the banker. I think it is that everybody's leveled out because money has actually become worthless at some point during the final judgment. The economic collapse of the world is going on here because in the context of God emptying, in verse 1, the entire earth. So I think we're talking about economic collapse. There's also lots of other things here. If you notice, in verse 6 at the end, it says, because of everything going on, the inhabitants of the earth are burned and few men are left. Now, I don't know what it means when it says few men are left, but I imagine it isn't the 9 billion people that we have on planet Earth at the minute. So great is the ultimate destruction that comes on this earth. It says that few men are left. What else have we got? There's a great shaking somewhere in this, verse 19. The earth is utterly broken down. The earth is clean dissolved. The earth is moved exceedingly. In fact, it says the earth reels to and fro in verse 20 like a drunkard. I don't know if you've ever seen a drunkard on the streets of certain coalfield. I'm sure there aren't that many. But if you did, they're not walking steady, are they? Somebody who's absolutely drunk is swaying. This is my impression of being drunk, swaying all over the place. And one thing that this world doesn't do is swing around like a drunkard. I mean, you think how stable planet Earth is. We get alarmed if there's a minuscule tilt because of a giant earthquake as there was in Japan. I mean, that's about as big as it gets, the most minuscule tilt. This isn't a drunkard, but the earth is going to swing around and move around like a drunkard. That says to me, this planet becomes physically unstable compared to where it is right now. Something happens. It's going to get shaken. So anyway, this is almost like the concluding chapter of all the burdens. All the burdens lead up to chapter 24. Now, you might say, why are we talking about burdens? So each of those 10 burdens have come from God as a message to Isaiah. And some of you in your version, it won't say burden, it will say oracle. Has anybody got oracle in their Bible? You need to go and find it, but have a look at the beginning of chapter 23. It says the burden of Tyre. We're not going there to start with. I'm just glancing down to find you a burden. Does yours say burden? You've got oracle. So some will say oracle. A lot of versions will say burden. I think burden's probably better than oracle, I guess, because effectively it's a burdensome message from God. The actual Hebrew word does mean something very heavy, very weighty, very difficult to bear. And it's certainly got the sense in the Hebrew of divine judgment. This is not a pleasant message. This is a very difficult message. If the message was in a box there, I would find it and I was told to carry it, I would struggle to pick it up. That's the sense of what God is giving here. As it says on the screen there, it's essentially a pronouncement of doom. It's a warning of impending disaster. And the 10 burdens are all different, all in relation to different nations, and all building up to Isaiah chapter 24, the final judgment of the world. So are you up for looking at these 10 burdens? Or do you want me to do something different at this point? We're sort of in it now, aren't we? We've got to do this. All right. So here are the 10 burdens. So there's the burden on Babylon, the burden on Philistia, the burden of Moab, the burden of Damascus, the burden of Cush, the burden of Egypt, the burden of Elam and Media, the burden of Duma and Arabia. And there's another one at the end, which we'll cover off as well, the burden of Tyre. But you can see what I've done is converted all these ancient names into place names. So Babylon becomes Iraq, Philistia becomes Gaza, Moab becomes Jordan, Damascus is Syria, Cush is Sudan, Egypt is easy because it's still Egypt, Elam and Media is Iran, and Duma and Arabia are Saudi Arabia. If you wanted to convert those ancient names into modern places, that's exactly where they all are. And then if you put them on a map, as we've done on the right, those are all the places where the burdens come. one after the other, all leading up to the final judgment of the world. So as you can see, they're all gathered around and in the vicinity of, to some extent, Iran's probably the furthest away, Israel. And by the way, as we'll see as we go through this, there is actually a burden of Jerusalem in amongst all this when we get to it as well. So it all starts off in Isaiah chapter 13 with the burden of Babylon. So come and have a look in your Bibles at Isaiah chapter 13. Now, the first thing I want to point out is, because look, we know, as I've already told you, that there's a huge amount of this that was fulfilled in ancient times with ancient Babylon. But I'm going to prove to you in 2 seconds flat that it wasn't only to do with ancient Babylon. And this is also about the last days. If you have a look in verse 9, it says there, behold, in relation to this burden of Babylon, it says, behold, the day of the Lord cometh both with wrath and fierce anger to lay the land desolate. He will destroy the sinners out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light, and the sun will be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. And I will punish the world for their evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease, and I will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible. I'll make a man more precious than fine gold. That actually is better translated. I'll make man more rare than fine gold. In other words, it would be hard to find a living human being at this point, even a man than the golden wedge of Ophir. Verse 13, look, therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts and in the day of his fierce anger. Now, all of those few verses there, every last one, all of them quoted ultimately in the, well, most of them are quoted in the Olivet prophecy, talking about the time of the end, direct quotes from these particular verses. And in a sense, of course, with the ending of original Babylon, you could argue that some of those things in symbolic terms went on. But you can see from an ultimate sense, when you take into account what we've just looked at in Isaiah 24, that also quotes these things, the shaking of the earth and so on, this is not just about thousands and thousands of years old. It's about the time of the end. Now, another clue that it isn't just about ancient Babylon and thousands of years ago is if you have a look in verse 4, bearing in mind verse 1 says this is the burden of Babylon. It actually says in verse 4, the noise of a multitude in the mountains, like of as a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts mustereth the host of the battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Now, you can look in any history book you like about the end of Babylon. And I'm telling you now, it will not read anything like that. Because how did Babylon, by the way, come to an end? Where do we read about Babylon coming to an end? Daniel chapter 5. And who was the Medes? Who happened to be one nation and happened to be the closest to Babylon. This doesn't sound like that. It says that they come from a far country from the end of heaven. And it also says in the previous verse that we just read that they're kingdoms of nations that have been gathered together. And in fact, in the days of ancient Babylon, it couldn't have been really more different than that. And it's because this isn't just about ancient Babylon. It's about the days, I believe, that count down to the final judgment of God. And things that happened in ancient times play out once again in the final run-up to Armageddon. Now, I know you might be thinking I've lost the plot here, but by the time I've finished, I'm hoping there's going to be a mounting amount of evidence to show you that this is one way of reading all these things. So you might say, okay, where is ancient Babylon? And ancient Babylon is exactly where now we would see modern day Iraq. There is no doubt about that. It isn't Iran, it isn't Syria, it's where we would now call modern day Iraq. So now I'm on alert, and was over 25 years ago when I started looking at these things, because I started the World Watch in October 2003 when things were happening. And this is what got me going. This is what started me looking at some of these things. And it's only in the last sort of few weeks that the whole picture has suddenly, like a big jigsaw puzzle, has all suddenly come together. And that's really what I'm sharing with you now. Now, if you remember, there was, in fact, a major conflict, was there not, over Iraq back in 2003. You remember this? Now, in fact, before 2003, there was a previous war over Iraq, wasn't there, in the 90s? You remember that? Gulf War One. That was very different to this war. The big difference with the first Gulf War is that Saddam Hussein had gone into Kuwait, and everybody was very concerned about that. And so the nations came to push Iraq out of Kuwait, but they didn't go into Iraq itself. They went in a mile or two and then stopped for some reason, and nobody knew why. And they went back to the bases, and that was the end of that war, because the objective was to push Iraq out of Kuwait. But in 2003, it was different. It was nations from afar off. I mean, you don't get much further away, I don't think, from Iraq than the United States and the United Kingdom and Poland and some other nations that all came in to attack Iraq. Now, this wasn't just a few troops. You know, Trump at the minute is talking about sending, he's got 10,000 troops on the way to Iran. Anybody know how many troops went into Iraq in 2003? Any guesses? 300,000 troops went into Iraq at that point. This is what it says in, you can look this up in many websites. On the 20th of March, 2003, the US-led coalition invaded Iraq as part of a global war on terror. You see, the spark of this war, anybody know what the spark of this war was? 9/11. And the spark of 9/11, when you wind the clock back a little bit further to see why did 9/11 even happen, has its roots in Jerusalem. But that's another story. Has all its roots in Jerusalem. They didn't just wake up one day and think, let's just fly planes in as a random thing. Had all its roots in Jerusalem. In other words, there was a problem over Jerusalem that sparked, the likes of Osama bin Laden to authorize these horrific attacks. Anyway, out of the smoldering ashes of 9/11 was the face of Saddam Hussein. And that's what America genuinely thought, that Saddam was somehow also behind it, hence them launching their attack on the axis of evil. Do you remember the phrase, the axis of evil? In Iraq, they said, is part of the axis of evil. So they went in with 300,000 troops. And it says here, in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Gulf War II, the subsequent occupation brought a level of destruction that transformed the country into a broken society and a devastated landscape, with impacts spanning infrastructure, society, and culture. The war, lasting from 2003 to 2011, resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, massive population displacement, and the collapse of state services, a catastrophic environment for Iraq. You notice what it says here, the noise of a multitude, like as of a great people, kingdoms of nations gathered together. They come from a far country and they destroy the land. And it's exactly what did happen. Now, the other very interesting thing is that at the very point that this happens, this guy is in control. Now, this guy is Saddam Hussein. And the reason I was interested in this guy is, one, he ruled Iraq, ancient Babylon. But more than that, Saddam Hussein claimed to be something. Anybody know what he claimed to be? Latter-day Nebuchadnezzar. Now, you can research this. No other human being since Nebuchadnezzar lived until now has ever claimed to be a latter-day Nebuchadnezzar. But at this exact point in time, 2,500 years since Nebuchadnezzar lived, a man's on the planet who says, I am, and this is a word for word what he said, I am a latter-day Nebuchadnezzar. And he had coins minted exactly like you see there, with Nebuchadnezzar in the background look and Saddam Hussein's face on the coin. And there was pictures all around Babylon, all with his face next to the ancient king. What he also decided to do, because he saw himself as a latter-day Nebuchadnezzar, he decided to rebuild ancient Babylon with about 35 million bricks. It was just a big deserted thing. Do you want to see what it looked like?
Who today remembers the legends of the grandeur that was ancient Babylon? President Saddam is one who does. Indeed, for the president of modern-day Iraq, ancient Babylon has more than mere historical significance. This is the southern palace of King Nebuchadnezzar. In the 6th century BC, he was the Middle East's top dog. And this is the throne room of King Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of the greatest empire the world had known until this time. And he made sure that everyone did know about it too.
And you can see some inscription from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, which is still as it is. The translate of this inscription, I am Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the world. Reconstruct this building to my family and to my God. I hope to help me in the lower life, that's mean in the death life. He liked to put his stamp on all the bricks there in Babylon.
The palace was rebuilt by President Saddam. He sees Nebuchadnezzar as the first Iraqi revolutionary and a man to emulate. It says, in the era of President Saddam Hussein, all Babylon was reconstructed in 3 stages. From Nebuchadnezzar to Saddam Hussein, Babylon is rising again.
Interesting, don't you think? Nobody ever lived in it, so the prophecy that Babylon wouldn't be rebuilt, i.e. be lived in again, still holds true. But there he is, building Babylon again. Now, the other thing, of course, I don't know if you're aware of this, I'm sure you are, but not only did he see himself as a latter-day Nebuchadnezzar, he ended up exactly like the ancient Nebuchadnezzar, because this is what he eventually was found looking like. So, you know, we went into hiding, and when they found him and pulled him out the pit, this is exactly what he looked like, which is uncannily sort of similar to what Nebuchadnezzar, the original Nebuchadnezzar, ended up looking like. You see the ancient painting there about what Nebuchadnezzar might have looked like when he became an animal with his long beard and so on. There's an uncanny sort of similarity here. Now, the reason that we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar is, if you look in Isaiah chapter 14, my Bible is headed up the King of Babylon. And it's quite amazing here to read some verses about the King of Babylon, who actually Saddam Hussein said that he actually was. If you look in verse 4, it says, take up this proverb against the king of Babylon. It never uses the name Nebuchadnezzar, and I think it doesn't, because it's relatable to future kings that were going to come along. Now, have a look in verse 15, because it says, talking about the king of Babylon, that you're going to be brought down to hell, or in a grave, to the sides of a pit. And you can imagine, when I saw the Daily Express all those years ago now, and saw that he was found in a pit, exactly the same language that's been used in Isaiah 14 verse 15, it's sort of quite interesting. And then they pull him out the pit, he even looks like ancient Nebuchadnezzar and what he might have looked like. And then it moves on from there, because in Isaiah 14, still talking about the king of Babylon, it says in verse 18, all the kings of the nations lie in state, each in his own tomb, but you are cast out of your tomb like a rejected branch. You're covered with the slain and with those who are pierced by the sword, those who descend to the stones of the pit. Like a corpse trampled underfoot, you will not join them in burial. So here it's telling us quite clearly, I think we got the ability for people to scribble on the screen, haven't we? I don't know if we can turn that off. It's quite interesting. At least they're not writing messages all over it. So Here we go. We've got rid of it. So basically, this is saying that unlike normal kings of Babylon that might be buried in a sort of a proper state funeral, you, king of Babylon, latter-day king of Babylon, are not going to. That's not going to happen. It says you will not join them in burial. What actually happened was, back on the 13th of December 2003, they found Saddam Hussein in a pit, dragged him out. He then went to trial, and he was hung on the 30th of December 2006. And nobody knows where he's buried. If you look up and say, I'd like to go and visit Saddam Hussein's tomb, you won't be able to find it. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody knows where he's buried, which is pretty much exactly what it says there. You notice it also says in this verse that, where is it? Sorry, verse 21, I think it is. It also says, look, in verse 21, prepare slaughter for his children. Modern versions say his sons, for the iniquity of their fathers. In other words, even his own sons are going to also come to an end. And in 2003, all of Saddam Hussein's sons were killed in the Iraq war by US troops. So there was nobody that could take over, unlike what we're seeing in Iran right now, where the son of the Ayatollah is supposedly now taken over. That couldn't happen because they killed his entire family. What is also quite amazing is that Isaiah 14 goes on and also says in verse 21, if you look at the end, it says, prepare a slaughter for his children for the iniquity of the fathers, for they do not rise nor possess the land nor fill. It's the verse before. Verse 20, you shall not be joined with them in burial because you have destroyed your land and slain your people. The two indictments against the ancient king of Babylon was that you have destroyed your land and slain your people. Do you realize when Saddam Hussein was brought to trial by America, there were two indictments against him? The first one was that you've destroyed the land, and the second one was that you have killed your own people. The destruction of the charge was against Saddam Hussein that you have persecuted the Marsh Arabs that lived in Iraq, and he was accused of, and this is what he was accused of and was convicted of. He was accused of draining the southern marshes to destroy an entire population that depended on these marshlands. So he literally dammed it up to force a whole group of people, I don't know how many, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, indigenous population, to evacuate. So that was the first accusation against him. The second one was that you've killed your own people. And the accusation was that 182,000 people of his own population were killed through mass executions, through forced disappearances, and through the use of chemical weapons. And all of those things he was convicted of, and they hung him. Nobody knows where he was buried. End of the story. Just go back to Isaiah 13, because something interesting is here in Isaiah 13. So remember, in Isaiah 13, we've got this conflict of nations from afar coming to what I believe is the modern country of Iraq. And what you find is in verse 17, after you've got the conflagration of all these nations that are coming against Iraq, it then says in verse 17, behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, which shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they will not delight in it. Their bows will dash the young men to pieces, and so on. So in other words, you got the nations coming in from afar. And then at some point after that, you've got the Medes being raised up. In ancient times, it was the Medes who knocked on the door, crept in into Belshazzar's feast, and took over pretty much overnight, didn't they? The Empire of Babylon, just like that. This is after the nations far away have come in. Now we've got the stirring up of the Medes. And what I've put on there is a weekly World Watch slide. Those who get the weekly World Watch might not recognize it like this, because originally this is what the slides look like, going back all those years when I was doing it. But I was reading back then about Iran starting to be raised up, because you might say, why did America go in and attack Saddam and not attack Iran? They're now attacking Iran. But Iran wasn't the bogeyman as it is now. It was Saddam and Iraq. But shortly after the war had concluded, Iran began in earnest developing missiles, developing its nuclear program, because it was frightened that what they saw happen to their neighbor Iraq could one day happen to them. So the Medes, the Iranians, started developing their own weapon systems at a rate of knots. They also started at this exact point in time backing Hamas, backing Hezbollah, and backing the Houthis with huge amounts of weapons to almost create another defensive line to stop America one day attacking them. And as you can see there, this goes back to January the 26th, 2006. This was just a World Watch slide. Iran holds a huge military exercise, and I've basically linked it, look, back to Isaiah 13, I will stir up the Medes. And all the way back then, I was thinking, we're going to see Iran being stirred up, and we're going to see Iran gradually getting more and more powerful. And Iran, as we're going to see, is going to crop up again in the burdens and bring us bang up to date. The other thing it says that we've just read is, behold, I'll stir up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver. They don't care for gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men. They will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity children. That's in verse 18 of Isaiah 13. So I was also thinking all the way back then, they're going to get obsessed with missiles. You know, Trump says he's blown their navy apart. Their beautiful navy's gone. I've blown the navy apart. There's nothing left of their navy. I've blown all this apart and that apart. But they don't care about their navy. All they care about are these things on the screen, their missiles. They were obsessed and are obsessed with missiles. And of course, now drone technology. It's exactly what Isaiah said they would be obsessed about. And notice they don't care about cash. So when Trump is trying to do a deal with them, you could tell him, I could ring him up now and say, well, money isn't going to work because they're ideologically driven. That's what that's saying. And so a whole hour's talk that we could do on this comes to an end, and we move to, do you want to look at the next burden? Well, the next burden is also in chapter 14, and it's in verse 28. It says in Isaiah 14, verse 28, in the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. So now we've got another burden. It just tells us when the burden was given. And it says, rejoice not thou, whole Philistia, it says in my Bible. Rejoice not thou, O Philistia, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. For out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice and a flying serpent, and so on. And it talks about a root coming out of them that's to do with famine and a slaying of the remnant in verse 20. And in verse 31, it says, wail, O gate, cry, O city, all of you Philistia are dissolved, for smoke will come from the north, and there'll be no straggler in his ranks. There's destruction effectively coming on Philistia. Now, you might say, okay, well, where is Philistia? So we go and look at Philistia. And there's a map that shows where Philistia was. And where it is where pretty much we would now call the Gaza Strip. They're not absolutely identical, but if we were trying to find a place on planet Earth now that lines up with Philistia, you would go to Gaza. So this now is a prophecy about Gaza. So we've just had the war with Iraq, and now we're into conflict and destruction coming in relation to Gaza. Now, here's a very, very interesting thing. You might think there's always been conflict between Israel and Gaza, but this is a catalogue of events that have happened over the last 15, 20 or so years. I don't know if you remember, but there was an Israeli president called Ariel Sharon. And Ariel Sharon, in his wisdom, decided to disengage from the Gaza Strip. And that was in the year 2005. And much to the upset of the people that lived, the Jews that lived in Gaza at the time, he pulled the Jews out of Gaza and handed it all over to the Palestinians that lived in that area. What then happened was, well, in January 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian parliamentary elections. So Israel pulls out in 2005, and in 2006, Hamas has now been elected. But it wasn't until June 2007 that Hamas actually got control of the full Gaza Strip. So now a terrorist organization has come into power in the very area that Ariel Sharon pulled out of, all following hot on the heels of the war in Iraq in terms of dates. And as you can see there, it's gone from crisis to crisis to crisis since Israel's done that. So in 2008, there was Operation Cast Lead. In 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense. In 2014, Operation Protective Edge, and so it went on. So there's all these operations now of Israel fighting against Gaza until we got to the point on the 7th of October 2023, when Hamas went in, and we know what they did. And since then, the escalations got greater and greater, and great destruction has come. What does it say in verse 31? Howl, O gate. I'm in chapter 14 of Isaiah. Cry, O city, thou whole Philistia art dissolved, for there will come from the north a smoke, and none shall be alone in his appointed times. So we're talking about great destruction coming on this area, and we have seen absolutely that. And it all began pretty much as the war in Iraq came to an end. This then came screaming onto our screens.
The war in Gaza has been at the top of the news for nearly 2 years. What many don't realize is 20 years ago, Israel's government expelled thousands of Jews from the territory. The move was supposed to bring peace, but it failed miserably. CBN News Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has this look at the recent and ancient history of Gaza.
In 2005, Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon uprooted 21 Jewish communities in the Gaza Strip and 4 in Samaria, or the northern West Bank, expelling 10,000 Israelis. Known as the disengagement, it was supposed to bring peace. Since then, Hamas and other terror groups have launched tens of thousands of rockets from Gaza, carried out many suicide bombings, and dug numerous terror tunnels. The murder of nearly 1,200 Israelis in the October 7th cross-border attack is deemed the worst massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust.
Okay, let's do another burden. We're now into chapter 15. This is the next burden. This is burden number 3. We've got the burden of Moab. What is the burden of Moab? Does anybody know, by the way, if you wanted to catch a flight to Moab, where would you catch a flight to? Which country? Jordan, exactly. Now, this is quite amazing because what you read about, we haven't got time to go through all of chapter 15, and there's a few verses in chapter 16 as well that talk about Moab. But basically, the burden is all about refugees and fugitives. That's the focus. There's no aggression at all mentioned in relation to Moab and Moab being an aggressor. It's all about what Moab's doing with refugees and fugitives. So here's some examples in verse 5 of chapter 15. By the way, look in verse 1, it says the burden of Moab. And in verse 5 of chapter 15, my heart shall cry out for Moab, his fugitives shall flee. Verse 7, the abundance that they have gotten, and that which they have laid up shall they carry away. And that verse, that phrase to carry away, is often used in relation to people that are having to flee with their wealth because they're fugitives. It's a direct link in the Hebrew back to fugitives. Chapter 16, verse 3, that's still talking about Moab, says, hide the outcasts, bewray not him that wandereth. That word for outcast there is a direct link in the Hebrew back to the word for fugitives or refugees. In Isaiah 16, verse 4, it says, let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab. You will be a cover to them from the face of the spoiler. In other words, it says, Moab, you're going to actually protect the fugitives. You're going to protect the outcasts, the refugees. Now, when you summarize the whole of chapter 15 and 16, it's talking about forced flight. It's talking about weeping migration. It's talking about the carrying of possessions by people who are homeless. It's talking about outcasts. It's talking about displaced persons. It's talking about wandering around without a home, all in relation to Jordan. Jordan has become the world's #1 country on planet Earth for refugees, bar none. There is absolutely no country on earth with as many refugees per capita as Jordan, not a single one. And it all really kicked off after the war in Iraq, because hundreds of thousands of people ended up going into Moab or Jordan after the Iraq war. And it developed because then we moved into the Syrian conflict that we're going to come on to any second. And after that, there were hundreds of, in fact, there was 1.4 million, I think, Syrians that fled into Jordan. And Jordan basically became a refuge center for all of these different conflicts that were happening. Just to give you some idea, Syria's uprising led to a mass influx into Jordan, and they hosted 1.4 million Syrians. Jordan hosts the largest number of registered Palestinian refugees anywhere on earth. The current number is 2.39 million Palestinians, or refugees, that live in Jordan. In fact, there's more Palestinians that live in Jordan as refugees than there are Palestinians that live in either the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. All of this is sort of quite amazing as we have Bible in hand. This is a slide we put together. Jordan's got the highest refugee population per capita in the world. 1 in 3 people is a refugee. This is enormous numbers of people. Some of them living in tents still, and so on. So we've got an absolutely enormous number of people that are living as refugees in this country. You might wonder why it is. It's to do with their constitution, amongst other things, that they are bound to look after people from other countries that are fleeing, and they do. And that's exactly what we read of here.
Jordan's handling of refugee influxes stands as a notable example of effective management amidst the challenges posed by regional instability. As a country bordered by conflict zones, Jordan has become a sanctuary for refugees primarily from Syria, but also from Iraq, Yemen, and other countries.
So there we are. You can go and study and see how amazing this is. And it all is following the same pattern. We start off with Iraq, then we start off with Hamas and what's gone on with there. Then Jordan becomes a home for refugees. It's flowing exactly through. Have we got time? I know it's 4 o'clock. Should we do one more quick burden and then we'll have a break? Are you sure? Because I don't know what time we started. Should we do another burden? Let's have one more burden. Come on. Where do you think the next burden is, by the way? You got it. So, chapter 17. Chapter 17 is the burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city. It will be a ruinous heap. If you have a look in verse 3, it says, the fortress will cease from Ephraim and the kingdom from Damascus. In other words, something's going to happen to Syria that's going to mean Damascus ceases to exist. But then what does it say? What did I just read? I've forgotten what I've just read. It was, the fortress shall cease from Ephraim and the kingdom from Damascus. In other words, the kingdom is going to cease. the nation is going to fail. That's what it's basically saying. Now, isn't this quite amazing? Because we've gone from Iraq, we've gone into Philistia, and we've gone into Hamas rising up. Then we've got Jordan with all the refugees pouring in. And at the same time, lo and behold, we've now got crisis in Syria. So if you remember, this was the Arab Spring that began in 2011, and it brought utter and complete devastation into the land of Syria. Civil war began in 2012. There were all these chemical, do you remember all the chemical attacks? And they dropped barrels with chemical weapons in. Horrific amount of destruction that went on. Russia suddenly intervened back in 2015. Here's a bit of a summary of what's on the screen. Over the last 15 years, from 2011 to 2026, Syria transformed from a state under authoritarian rule into a devastated battleground, culminating in the 2024 fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime. Beginning with 2011, Arab Spring protests, the crisis escalated into a complex civil war, bringing in foreign powers, fueling the Islamic State's rise, and causing massive displacement before a swift 2024 rebellion toppled Assad, leaving a fragile and extremely damaged nation. Now, clearly, we haven't seen the fulfillment entirely of Isaiah 17 yet, because it says Damascus ceases to be a city. In fact, I'm going to put to you right now that all of these burdens, every one of them, have still got outstanding things to be fulfilled, whether it's to do with Iraq, whether it's to do with Hamas, whether it's to do with Jordan, and whether it's to do with Damascus and the others that we're going to look at. There's still things to still come with all of them. But the pattern is there, and all of them have been activated, and all of them are underway. The launch sequence has begun. So what is interesting is the destruction of Damascus went right up to Damascus's own city walls almost. The suburbs of Damascus were utterly obliterated in the conflict that we saw over the last decade or so between Assad and his people. This is what Wikipedia says. While Damascus did not experience the same level of total citywide annihilation as Aleppo or Homs, parts of the capital and its outskirts suffered immense destruction during the civil war, with specific areas of Damascus seeing up to 70 to 80% destruction. So the suburbs of Damascus were absolutely destroyed. The very central part, the inner city, is still in one place, in one piece. That at some point is going to go. But have a look at this. This is a drone flying over one of the suburbs of Damascus. It's a sign of where things are going to end up. And ultimately, Damascus is going to cease to be a city. It's still outstanding. But interestingly, people during the time of the conflict with Syria were latching on to Isaiah 17. And I was watching this particular, I think it might have been CNN, and I managed to get a recording of it. And so this is like everyday news channel in America. Have a listen to this.
And how about this to think about today? The crisis in Syria may be more than just a current foreign policy problem, with some seeing signs of biblical prophecies of the apocalypse in the events that are unfolding overseas. Passages in the Old Testament even make reference to Damascus falling into ruin, sparking worldwide conflict that some say leads to the coming of the Messiah. Joel Rosenberg is a former aide to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he is a Middle East analyst and has written several books on this issue. Joel, welcome. Good to have you with us today.
Good to be with you, Martha.
You know, I think it's very interesting to look at this from that historic biblical perspective, because in many ways, obviously, what you have here is a clash of civilizations in a larger sense, and of Christianity and of radical Islam, and this desire for a caliphate on the part of radical Islamists in that part of the world. So explain to us, take us through Isaiah and what your thinking is on what the Bible says about this.
Well, Martha, it is fascinating. We don't know for certain that the current events are definitely going to play out to be the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, but the implosion of Syria definitely has people interested. Isaiah 17 and its parallel passage in Jeremiah 49 both describe the absolute destruction, the catastrophic destruction of Damascus at some point in the eschatological future, the end times. Isaiah 17 verse 1 says, Damascus will be removed from being a city. One translation says it will cease to be a city. Now, Damascus has been attacked, it's been conquered throughout history, but it's never been removed as a city. It's one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the face of the earth, first mentioned in the Bible in Genesis, and now we're still talking about it today.
Yeah.
There you go. So we're going to have a break, and after the break, we're going to look at the burden of Sudan. We're going to have a look at the burden of Egypt. We're going to have a look at the burden of Iran and what's happening now. We're going to have a look at the burden of Saudi Arabia. We're going to have a look at the burden of Jerusalem. And we're going to see why it is, after all of that, there is something called the burden of Tyre. And by the end of it, you'll see that the whole sequential pattern of all these events has played out one after the other, exactly as God has put them in this exact order, right up to the point where we're going to see Isaiah 24 and the judgment of the world. So if you're not here after the break, I'll know that I've put you off, but otherwise we'll have a break. Okay, so we're on burden number 5. Good, you're all with me. Excellent. So burden number 5 comes in Isaiah chapter 18. So hopefully my computer still is working. Looks like it is. So here we go. I've called it here the burden of Sudan. I've sort of leapt ahead a little bit and given the game away by telling you that, because it doesn't say Sudan in your Bible. Have a look in verse 1. It says, woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, and so on. I may as well read the second verse. It sends ambassadors by the sea, even in vessels of bulrushes upon water, saying, go, you swift messengers, to a nation scattered and peeled, to a nation terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden down, whose land the rivers have spoiled. So you might say, well, wait a minute, how have we possibly got to say Sudan out of those couple of verses? There's obviously more to read, but because of time, we're not looking at all of the verses here. The first thing to say is, in verse 1, I've got here the word Ethiopia. Have you got any different name in your Bible? Does it say anything different to Ethiopia? Cush, C-U-S-H, yes, Cush, right. So because in the original Hebrew, it doesn't say the word Ethiopia. All that's happened is when the original translators decided to translate from the original Hebrew, they saw the word Cush, thought to themselves unusually, well, that doesn't mean anything to anybody, so we'll convert it into the modern country of Ethiopia. I don't honestly know why they do that with this particular name, because they don't do it with, say, Moab. They don't put Jordan, but for some reason they do that with this particular nation, because the original word is Cush, and Cush was a place, just like Moab was a place. And the reason that I'm making a thing of this is that actually, in my view, I'm going to show you this in a second, it isn't Ethiopia. Cush is not Ethiopia. Cush is Sudan. And I'm going to show you a map to prove that to you. So there's something here going on with Sudan. There's one other thing I just wanted to mention here. It says, woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. That word, you see where it says beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. It sounds like we're talking about a land that is some distance away from this place called Cush. But the word that is translated beyond is much better translated alongside. So this place called Cush is alongside these rivers. And basically, I'll read you this from the Wikipedia. It says, the rivers of Cush primarily refer to the Blue Nile, White Nile, and the Atbara rivers that flow through this ancient place, modern-day Sudan, into Ethiopia. But it's all around the area of Sudan. So let me put a map on so you see what I'm talking about. There is on the screen sort of where the kingdom of Cush, I know it's got a K, and you know, we see it with a C in our Bibles, but it's one and the same place. There was where the kingdom of Cush was all the way back when Isaiah was writing. Well, by the way, when was Isaiah writing? How long ago was all this written down, do you think? 700 BC is a very good answer. We'll take that. So 700 BC, so 2,700 years ago is when Isaiah was written. And he writes about Cush, and that's where it was. Now, if I superimpose over Cush the modern nations, obviously Egypt doesn't really change much because it's not changed, but there is where it is. So you see what we've got there is Cush. If I wind it back a bit so you can see, there's Cush, look. And now I put modern nations over it. You can see Sudan pretty much is lined up identically with ancient Cush. Now, I don't know if you noticed something strange here, but can you see it's got Sudan there in orange? But notice it's got another nation underneath it, South Sudan. Does anybody know when South Sudan was created? It was about that. It was 2011, so about 15 years ago. In fact, South Sudan is the newest nation on planet Earth, and it was created in 2011. Basically, if you want to look at the history of what's gone on in this area, it's been a history of intense conflict. Civil war, as it says there, that began in early 2000s. And it's basically mainly a sort of a religious and ethnic war that's been going on in Sudan. The reason is, does anybody know what the predominant religion is? I mean, I say predominant religion, I think it's at well over 95% of the kingdom at the top now, that's just called Sudan. What's the main religion of that, do you think? Muslim. What's the main religion of South Sudan? Christian. So, but for a long time, this was just one big country until 2011, when the country split in half. And what actually happened was, as you can see there, in 2011, the South voted for independence by a huge margin. And now two nations have been created in this particular area. But again, these significant things are all happening in exactly the same time period that we're looking at. And you might wonder to yourself, what is this place that perhaps a lot of people haven't really thought much about? Why is this even significant in relation to the build-up to Armageddon? And I'm going to show you. But let me just read this to start with. This is from Wikipedia. Sudan's history is defined by chronic civil war and conflict over its national identity, leading to the creation of South Sudan in 2011. Decades of war between Arab Muslim North and the marginalized South, fueled by inequality and resource disputes, resulted in two main conflicts, killing over 2.5 million people and leading to the succession of South Sudan. North Sudan is predominantly Sunni Muslim, over 90 to 97% are Sunni Muslim, with a history of Islamic law, while South Sudan is predominantly Christian, roughly 60%, and then there's some African religions in there as well. So let me just play you this little video here.
Have you ever looked at a map and noticed that there is a country called South Sudan and ever wondered why did it break away from Sudan? Why wouldn't it just remain a part of Sudan, and what actually happened? Well, to find out the answer, we have to go back some years in time. This is the story of why South Sudan broke away from Sudan, and the reason why will surprise you. First off, Sudan used to be massive, but it wasn't unified at all by culture, religion, and language. The north of Sudan was mostly Arab and Muslim, tied culturally to the Middle East, while the south was largely Christian or indigenous African, with completely different languages, ethnic groups, and traditions. This conflict started early. When Sudan gained independence from Britain in 1956, it didn't take long for a civil war to break out. And not just once, but twice. Two brutal civil wars, the first from 1955 to 1972, and then the second from 1983 to 2005. The South felt constantly pressured by the Arab-dominated government in Khartoum, located in the northern part of Sudan. In 2005, a peace agreement was finally signed, called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which gave South Sudan the right to vote for independence. And in 2011, 98.8% of the people of South Sudan voted for independence. On July 9, 2011, South Sudan officially became the newest country on Earth. However, South Sudan still faces some struggles with its own civil war from 2013. So why did South Sudan break away from Sudan? Because decades of war and cultural division made unity of Sudan impossible, and that proves to you sometimes breaking away might just be the choice you need to take.
I'm not sure about that last sentence, but anyway, there we go. So massively significant events are happening in the sequence of events that we got here in relation to the land of Cush. Now, you might say, well, how does this have anything to do with anything? Well, there's a number of reasons why this is very, very significant. You see, now the country is split into two. You've now got a 90 to 97% very extreme Muslim country that's together and can operate without all of the problem of the Christian group that was holding it back below. So this new Muslim country, effectively, the North has become essentially its own new Muslim country, is now able to do some pretty remarkable things in their view. And one of the things that they have done, and you might have seen this on the news in only sort of the last month or so, is that they have tied themselves and allied themselves to which nation do you think? Russia. Here's what Wikipedia says. Russia is Sudan's strongest investment partner, and Russia has repeatedly and significantly regarded Sudan as an important global ally in the African continent. Russia is finalizing a 25-year deal to develop a naval logistics base in Port Sudan to secure a strategic foothold on the Red Sea, enabling it to dock up to 4 warships, including nuclear-powered vessels.
Sudan has cleared the way for Russia's first naval base in Africa, a 25-year deal on the Red Sea in exchange for weapons. Now, this move, it comes as Sudan's military fights a brutal civil war against a paramilitary force inside the nation, RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. Sudan has offered Russia a long-term naval base on the Red Sea near Port Sudan, which is one of the world's busiest trade routes. According to Sudanese officials, the base would host up to 300 Russian personnel and dock 4 naval vessels, including nuclear-powered ships. In return, Sudan's military would receive air defense systems from Russia and other weapons at preferential prices. Officials say the weapons are urgently needed as fighting has intensified with RSF since April 2023, causing a humanitarian crisis in the country.
Anybody want to tell me where else Cush is mentioned in the Bible? I might put it another way. Where else is Ethiopia mentioned in the Bible? Ezekiel 38. And Ezekiel 38 is all talking about Russia invading where? Israel. And on the list of nations that are allied to Russia when Russia finally invades Israel, which is ultimately Armageddon, first on the list is Iran. And I don't know if it's second or third on the list, but on the list, it says in the authorized version, Ethiopia. But as I've already told you, Ethiopia, the original word is Cush, and Cush equals Sudan. And here is Sudan now allied to, since the breakup in 2011, allying itself to Russia. So in other words, this is categorically part of the story of the lead up to Armageddon, which is why God's put it in here. Not only is it in the time sequence, it's also fundamental to what is about to come down the track when all nations are gathered against Jerusalem to battle. These people are, when you read the verses, we haven't got time to go all through all the detail of the verses, but it talks about them being like a polished sword that's pulled out of a sheath, and they are super aggressive people. By the way, they are super aggressive people. If you look what the North did to the Christian South, it is horrific. Absolutely shocking, the destruction that they would bring. I mean, bearing in mind they were one nation at that point, even though obviously there were divisions, but the same aggressive attitude. And that's why Russia likes these people. I mean, bearing in mind, of course, Russia is friendly with Iran, and Iran's supporting the Ukraine war, and now Russia's supporting Iran in the conflict that we see happening now. We'll touch on that in a minute. So I think we can see why God's put it in the sequence. The timing is right, but also it's playing into what is going to come down the track. Where is the next burden? Well, the next burden comes in Isaiah chapter 19, and verse 1 says, the burden of Egypt. I really like this one because I can just say Egypt, and we can go to British Airways and book a flight to this place. I can't book a flight to Cush. I can't book a flight to Moab. I can book a flight to Egypt. People are going to say, I know where Egypt is. It would have been very handy if all the place names had all stayed the same, and I wouldn't have to try and show you ancient maps to modern day countries. But as it is, Egypt somehow or other has kept its name. Now, again, this is quite a long chapter. I think there's 25 verses or so. So I'm picking out the key points that are in this chapter, as I have done with all the others. But the key bit that comes out, I think, to me when I read this chapter is civil war. Verse 2 says, I will set Egyptian against Egyptian. Everyone will fight against his brother, everyone against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. Verse 4, the Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them. So there's all this fighting, and then there's somebody fierce that ends up ruling over them. The Lord has mingled a perverse spirit in the midst of Egypt, and they've caused Egypt to err in all her work as a drunken man staggers in his vomit. Now we go and have a look. I mean, this isn't going to surprise you anymore, is it? Do you think I'll be able to show you something like this that's happened in recent years in Egypt? Or do you think I'm going to have to sit down and say, can't match this one? In January the 25th, 2011, protests erupted. Do you remember this, by the way? It was headline news. I mean, there was talk of this being historic uprising in Egypt. The videos that a lot of them have been taken down now that I once watched on YouTube were horrific in terms of the violence between Egyptian and Egyptian, and a lot of it was caught on camera of literally people killing each other in the street. I mean, it's horrendous to see. It was to force ultimately Mubarak to stand down because Mubarak, of course, had been in power a long time. And the military eventually took control. And then Mohamed Morsi got into power. And again, there was riots on the streets, Egyptian fighting Egyptian again. There's a military coup. And so it went on for quite a number of years. These are some of the things I've pulled out here. In 2011, there was the revolution, the ousting of Hosni Mubarak. He had been in power an incredibly long length of time, from 1981 to 2011. And by the way, this is now another leader who's been in power an enormous length of time that's now out of power in the sequence that we're looking at. Who was the other leader that I've already told you that has got removed from power? Well, Saddam Hussein, absolutely. Had he been in power for decades? I think so. I think he came into power in 1980 or maybe even before then, but certainly around about the, might even have been mid-70s. So he had been in power 25, 30 years. Who was the other leader that got removed in the sequence? Assad, Bashar al-Assad. How long had he been in power? 20 plus years. And in fact, his, you know, is a family dynasty because his father had ruled it before then for decades. Now we've got this guy who's also been in power for decades, also removed from power, this time through revolution and Egyptian turning against Egyptian. Now, when Hosni Mubarak was removed from power, guess what? This wasn't a nice person that sort of ends up coming in. There's military rule over Egypt at this point. In fact, right now, Egypt is still governed under military occupation, really, right now. And what did it say? It said, hold on, let me go back a slide. The Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them. And actually, despite all their rioting and all their fighting, they've ended up really with just more oppression. Have a look at this. Millions and millions and millions of people. I found that because it's one of the few videos I could show where people aren't literally killing themselves in the street. Horrendous time, all in the sequence of events. Which now brings us to the next one, which is in Isaiah chapter 21, which was the original reading we had all those hours ago. Right, we finally got there. So here we've got the burden of Elam. And well, that isn't quite right, actually. It's this slide says the burden of Elam and Media. It sort of is, but that isn't quite how it puts it. If you have a look at Revelation, if you have a look at Isaiah chapter 21, it says the burden of the desert of the sea. And you say to yourself, okay, there's a burden of the desert of the sea. I mean, there's a lot of deserts and there's a lot of sea. So this isn't really that helpful. It says, as whirlwinds in the south pass through, so it comes from the desert, from a terrible land. A grievous vision is declared unto me. The treacherous dealer dealeth treacherously, and the spoiler spoileth. Go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media. All the sighing thereof I have made to cease. Therefore are my loins filled with pain. Pangs have taken hold upon me, as the pangs of a woman that is in travail or in labor. I was bowed down at the hearing of it. I was dismayed at the seeing of it. So here we go. This is another burden. Now, what number are we up to now? I've lost track of my burdens. It's number 7. We are motoring. We're going faster than I thought. So we've got to work out what this is talking about, a bit like, well, all of the others, you've got to sort of decode them a bit. But we're told specifically that this is something to do with Elam and Media. So I know it's to do with the burden of the desert of the sea, and it's something to do with places called Elam and Media. And once again, we're in this world of, I can't get a British Airways flight to Elam, please, or Media. They don't exist. So I then go and find where they exist. And here is where they exist. That is where Elam actually was in ancient times. It is in southwest Iran, and it runs along the Persian Gulf. And Media is pretty much where the name Iran there is on the map. So essentially, when it says Elam and Media, It's specifically saying Iran and absolutely along the coastline of the Persian Gulf, which is quite interesting. Now, the other thing is, it says there in verse 1, it's the desert of the sea. And nobody would ever describe the sea as a desert, really, would they? The desert of the sea sounds a bit strange. But when you look at the original Hebrew, it can be translated desert of the sea. It can also be translated desert by the sea. It can also be translated desert near the sea. So I'm thinking to myself, the sea that's being talked of here is probably which sea? Which sea would you think it is? If I was giving you multiple choice, it's the North Sea, the Indian Sea, the Atlantic, or the Persian Gulf. Which one might you say? There's not, I think a 5-year-old would probably get this one right, because there's no other sea that Elam bordered apart from the Persian Gulf. Now, it says the desert of the sea. So I wondered along where Elam was, I wonder what it looks like. Do you want to see what it looks like along that area? I wonder if it looked like desert. So I go on to it's just nothing. It's just desert, 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 desert. That's what it looks like. By the way, on the other side of the Persian Gulf, what do we see on the other side of the Persian Gulf? Does it look like that? Skyscrapers, because what cities do we see on the other side? Dubai, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi. Beautiful, beautiful. Look at what we've done. More air traffic landing in Dubai than any airport in the world. Millions and millions of people all descending on it. Partly because of travel connections through to the, into the southern hemisphere, partly because people like it because it's, the height of what mankind's produced. Doesn't look like that. It looks like cities and amazing things that we've created, but not on the Elam side. It's still a desert. Now, you might say, this is 2,700 years, are we not, after Isaiah wrote? This could have been looking exactly like Dubai now, couldn't it? 2,700 years later. This could be looking like Abu Dhabi. Skyscrapers and amazing cities and palm islands. But it doesn't. It's still the desert by the sea. Exactly the same. Now, the next bit says, just remind yourself here, because it says, look, in verse 2, it says, go up, O Elam, besiege, O Media. Now, that word go up is a very specific Hebrew word, Allah, which actually means in the Hebrew to rise up militarily. This isn't like just going up a hill on a walk. It's a specific military word that is used when a nation is going up to war. It means to attack, and it means to march forward. It means to go to battle. So we're being told that Elam is going to go to battle, is going to go to war, and we're told that Media is going to besiege. Now, I think we all understand what a besiege is. If I was wanting to besiege an ancient castle with my army, I would surround that castle and besiege it so nothing can go in and nothing can come out. And we gradually starve it, don't we? So now we've got a military operation that's to do with blockade and besieging and constricting and confining. And it's something to do with which sea? Now, it doesn't take a genius to see where I'm going with this, does it? We're looking for a military operation that's something to do with Iran, there's something to do with the Persian Gulf, that's to do with the blockade that's stopping something happening. Well, have a look at this.
If Iran blocks the Strait of Hormuz, what impact will it have on the entire world, and which country will be affected the most? First, let's understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. It is a small area of just 33 kilometers located between Iran, Oman, and the UAE. It is a narrow sea passage through which almost 20% of the world's oil supply flows, nearly 17 million barrels every day. This oil comes from 8 countries located in the Persian Gulf, including Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE for the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar, 90% of their oil exports pass through this narrow route to reach the rest of the world. If Iran blocks the Strait of Hormuz, following countries will suffer the most damage. First is India, because it imports 85% of its oil, and 60% of that comes from Middle Eastern countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE. Fuel prices in India would skyrocket, and as a result, everything related to oil and all industries would face severe disruption. Industries could shut down, there would be job losses, and the economy would be severely affected. The second most affected country would be China. China is the world's largest oil importer, bringing in 10 million barrels of oil every day. 40% of China's oil imports pass through this Strait of Hormuz. Although China has built oil pipelines with Russia and Central Asia, they don't even fulfill 20% of its energy needs. So, if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, China's economy could suffer a massive blow, and if China's economy is shaken, its effects will be felt all over the world.
The reason you know that America has got tens of thousands of troops and bases in Saudi Arabia is for one reason and one reason only. It's not because they like Saudi Arabia and just think, oh, isn't it nice for us to have tens of thousands of people in Saudi Arabia? They're there for one reason, and that is to keep the oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. It's as simple as that. They've got to keep the oil flowing because 20% of the world's energy passes through the Strait of Hormuz. And it's a little bit like if you block that, if you besiege it, if Elam was to rise up and block it, it's like shutting down an artery in your body. If you blocked a major artery in your body, within minutes, you're going to feel it. And if it isn't sorted out quickly, you would die. I'm pretty certain for most major arteries. If you block it, you're in a whole heap of trouble. There is no artery from an economic perspective in the entire world that even comes close to the artery of the Strait of Hormuz. There isn't another one where there's 30% going through and another one where there's no. This is astronomical amounts going through a tiny, tiny pinch point. And this is why America has got all of the machine that it's got there to try and keep the energy flowing. As Trump rightly says, we don't need to because we produce enough oil and gas ourselves. But for the world's economy, that's why the bases historically have been put there.
All of this presence in the area from the United States is generally in place to ensure that the oil continues flowing, and to counter Iran's influence over on the other side of the strait. The United States and Iran have had no official diplomatic relations for more than 40 years now, since 1980, and relations between the two sides of the strait have been continuously tense. In the event of a war breaking out, Iran has made numerous threats over the years to close the Strait of Hormuz from their side over to Oman, which, if successful, would shatter the world economy. And that's enough of a threat to always make America, or any other foreign power, think twice.
Now this, as you can hear, was recorded before where we've got to now, but I have this exact talk all about that one day the Strait of Hormuz, I believe, will be blockaded in YouTube talks going back at least a decade. So I'm not jumping on the back of what's just happening now and trying to make it fit. I've said for 10 years at least in the Weekly World Watch, and it's out in the open domain on videos, that this, I believe, is going to happen because I'm reading Isaiah 21. And where else is Elam going to besiege? It's a burden of the desert of the sea.
Iran also possesses a massive arsenal of thousands of maritime mines that they could theoretically quickly fill the 30-mile-wide strait with that would ground all trading activity through it to a halt for who knows how long. Theoretically, Iran could probably shut the strait down, but doing so would almost certainly invoke a very sharp response from a coalition of countries who would be staunchly opposed to it, likely led by the
Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that Trump has gone out, has he not, with a message that says, please, please send your ships to come and help us to open up the Strait of Hormuz. And he's got a resounding no or very lukewarm response from just about everybody. The trouble is, you see, that while conflict is raging, you go into the Strait of Hormuz with a warship, as powerful as it is, and you're there as a sitting duck. This is why America has not sent its destroyers through the Strait of Hormuz right now. It won't, because it is too vulnerable, because it's right up against the shoreline. And despite what Trump says, that everything's now destroyed and they've got nothing left, clearly that isn't right, because as of even today, they're firing missiles at Israel, at Abu Dhabi, at Dubai, at the oil fields. And this is nothing compared to what they could do if somebody came right up close to their coastline with their thousands. You know, he says he destroyed their navy. He's right. They had a very limited, small navy, but that's not Iran's tactic. Iran's tactic isn't the navy. They don't care two hoots about the navy going. The way they operate in this area is with thousands and thousands of tiny little speedboats armed with explosives that can swarm ships and cause damage.
Iran has spent years developing weapons that could threaten the entire global economy. And now that the country's at war, it has started to use them. The conflict has all but frozen commercial shipping. And at the heart of the crisis is a narrow waterway that Iran is holding hostage. The Strait of Hormuz is the choke point leading into and out of the Persian Gulf, and it's bordered by Iran's coastline.
And as the world is seeing, they are exercising sheer desperation in the Straits of Hormuz.
Even though Iran doesn't have jurisdiction over the strait, it has long threatened to use force to shut it down. Before the war, Iran had stockpiled sea mines that it could lay across the strait, dispersed coastal defense cruise missiles that could be fired at ships from the shore, created a fleet of small boats known to swarm and threaten vessels, and deployed submarines to lurk in strategic waterways. Iran also built an arsenal of drones, which it has used to attack civilian targets and ships. That's a key reason why the US has been so focused on sinking Iran's navy and destroying Iran's weapons.
And this means going after Iran's mine-laying capability and destroying their ability to attack commercial vessels.
But so far, Iran has still been able to mount attacks. And experts say that even just the possibility that Iran has laid mines in the strait is enough to scare ships from crossing it.
About 2 weeks ago, President Trump ordered an elite 2,000-strong force of American troops that are currently on their way now into this particular area. Nobody quite knows what they might do. Some say they might try and take over some of the oil installations. Nobody quite knows. But America is definitely gearing up potentially to ratchet up. So rather than back down, it could actually get a whole bunch worse yet. And these troops are on the way. There's in fact about 10,000 on the way. There's some elite troops on the way. And there's also about 8,000 other troops on the way. So we wait to see what actually happens here. But what we do know is right now, whereas 100 ships a day, tankers were going through every single day. This is the choke point that we're talking about with the Strait of Hormuz. It's now down to 5 or 6 a day. And Iran controls those 5 or 6 and says, you can come through because you're okay. But 95% of the tankers have been stopped. They've stopped because of the threat of what Iran might do. They haven't even mined it yet. They haven't even launched. They have launched some attacks. It's the threat. What that does, you know, is pushed up the insurance prices through the roof. So now it's too expensive to put a ship through. So basically, they just all sit still. And now the artery, the main energy artery of planet Earth, is shuddering to a halt. And that is why you could drive past a petrol pump this morning and see a different price on the way home. Have you seen that? And this is just the start. At the minute, we're using up enormous amounts of our reserves at a rate of knots. If this continues at about another month, we're out of reserves and you haven't seen anything yet. The oil price at the minute is about $110 a barrel. It could become $200 a barrel overnight if this isn't sorted. So the world's on a much more fragile point, and that's why, the stock markets that have sort of juddered a bit could seriously get impacted. Now, when you think about it, if you have a look down in the next verses, Isaiah that's seeing this vision, whatever he's looking at has scared him very, very much indeed. Look what he says in verse 3. My loins, he sees all this stuff going on. He says, my loins are filled with pain. Pangs have taken hold upon me as pangs of a woman that travaileth. In other words, it's like, a woman in travail. It's like a woman in labor. I'm seeing horrendous contractions because of this besiege that is going on. One other thing I was just going to mention, I'm delving a bit more into detail into this chapter because it's bang up to date. But if you have a look in verse 2 again, it says, a grievous vision is declared unto me, the treacherous dealer dealeth treacherously. You see that? In fact, in Isaiah 24, verse 16, the final judgment of the world chapter, it says the same thing, but it's in the past tense. It says, the treacherous dealers have dealt treacherously. Yea, the treacherous dealers have dealt very treacherously. Whereas in Isaiah 21, it says, the treacherous dealer dealeth treacherously. So Isaiah 24 is going back and saying, look what they did, the treachery. And in Isaiah 21, where we are right now, it's about the treacherous dealer is dealing treacherously. Now, you might disagree with this, but there's been a lot of talk, has there not, about deals and Iran. Has there not? That word deal is used all the time. We're trying to do a deal. We're going to do a deal with Iran. Nuclear deals. How long has it been going on between America trying to make a deal with Iran? Anybody know when that started in earnest? Which was the president that tried to do a deal or did do a deal? Obama is the right answer. President Obama, which I can't remember the year, but it'll probably come up in a second, not that long ago, probably 2015, is it? Something like that, did a deal. But the concern was that actually was this a treacherous deal. Have a look at this.
Because America negotiated from a position of strength and principle, we have stopped the spread of nuclear weapons in this region.
این ایستادگی مردم و مقاومت بود که طرف مقابل را به خوبی پای میز مذاکره آورد.
A win-win solution.
This is the good deal that we have sought.
About 6 months ago, Iran stopped all inspectors going in to check on what they were doing, which was part of the deal. But because Trump had effectively pulled out the deal, they said, you can't come and inspect our sites anymore. And if you remember, Trump made a big thing about sending his B-52 bombers over and dropping enormous bombs. He was sort of saying, apart from nuclear weapons, there's nothing bigger than what we've just dropped on my big, beautiful bombs, he called them. No, my big, beautiful bombs. And he dropped 30,000-pound bombs on the nuclear sites in Iran last year. But clearly it's not enough because they've gone back again. But that was the deal that Obama did. Interestingly, well, I thought it was interesting because I got this book. It's by Mohammed al-Baradei. Now, Mohammed al-Baradei was the head of the IAEA, the International Atomic Agency, Atomic Energy Agency. And what he did was was he was managing the conversation between Iran and America, because obviously it's the IAEA that have got to go in and do the inspections, right? So they're totally involved in the deal. And he wrote a book after he had stepped down, and he called it The Age of Deception, Nuclear Diplomacy in Treacherous Times. Well, what did it say? The treacherous dealer dealeth treacherously. And this whole book is about the treachery of Iran. Because I think any of us would say, without needing a degree in geopolitics, that Iran, if it could, would create a nuclear bomb. Would you think if it could, it would? I mean, it's hitting all its nearby neighbors. It's supposed to be semi-friendly with, and it surely, if it got a nuclear weapon, it would throw it at its arch enemy like Israel if it could. Nobody doubts at all that it was trying its hardest to create a nuclear weapon, and everything Obama did was to try to stop that happening. But then this happened.
Well, the threat from Iran goes far beyond its support of terrorism. The world is focused on the war against Hamas in Gaza, and Tehran is using the distraction as a cover to develop its nuclear weapons program. CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell has that story.
As Israel fights Hamas in the south and prepares for a potentially greater conflict with Hezbollah in the north, Iran remains a major player behind the chaos. That could be due to the regime trying to distract the world from what's happening with the country's nuclear program.
Whether it is a formal strategy or it's just happening that way, it's absolutely a danger. Iran threw out the nuclear inspectors, 8 most important ones, in September 2023. They tripled the speed of enriching uranium for most of the last few months, between 60% and 20% enriched uranium.
Experts believe the regime has enough uranium to make up to 8 nuclear weapons.
They could enrich to 90% weaponized uranium in like a week or two. Israel, the United States, the world is very distracted by Hamas, Hezbollah, and the rest of the world by Ukraine. So could Iran try to break out now? Yeah.
Iran claims it successfully launched 3 satellites earlier this year. Bob sees this as especially significant in terms of weapons delivery systems.
The technology they use for launching satellites can also be used potentially for nuclear weapons.
So there we are. So we're in the middle of this. I actually think we're sat right now in Isaiah chapter 21. I really do, in the sequence of events. And just to recap where we've sort of got to here, we start off in 2003 with Saddam Hussein, who'd been in power all those years, removed from power. We then went into Egypt, and we found that Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, who had been in power for decades and decades through all of the uprising of Egyptian against Egyptians, removed from power. We then see destruction coming right up to the borders of Damascus and the Damascus suburbs being destroyed. And another leader that had been in power for decades, Bashar al-Assad, is removed from power. We haven't really touched on Hezbollah, but they're in amongst Hamas and Hezbollah that were fighting in Philistia, the Gaza Strip against Israel. All of the leaders, Hamas leaders and Hezbollah leaders, one by one, were all killed during the ongoing Inner Ring War. And then we get to chapter 21, and the Ayatollah that's been in power for decades himself, we know, has been killed. And therefore his son now has come into power, who nobody has seen, but let's assume he's there. But you can see that what's been going on is a sequence of events that categorically is leading us up to the final event, which is about the Armageddon centered on Jerusalem. Yeah, there's one other burden though. There's actually 2 burdens here also in chapter 21. In verse 11, there is the burden of Duma, and in verse 13, there is the burden of Arabia. And these 2 are very much linked together because they're both areas of modern day Saudi Arabia, right? So one of the verses here, this is verse 13 and 15, the burden upon Arabia, this is Saudi Arabia. They fled from the swords, from the drawn sword, from the bent bow, and from the grievousness of war. Now, that's quite interesting, don't you think? Do you think at the minute people living in Saudi Arabia are feeling the grievousness of war? You are certainly feeling it if you're anywhere close to the Persian Gulf. And Arabia, I believe, covers the likes of Kuwait and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, because it's all these Gulf Arab nations that are there. And it basically says that they flee from the swords and from the bent bow. Now, obviously, it doesn't say missiles, but for me, when it talks about bent bows, bending the bow and firing an arrow, we're not expecting in the last days people to have physical bows and arrows. We are expecting the equivalent, which looks a lot more dramatic, but it's still an arrow being fired to cause death and destruction. So this says to me that actually there's more trouble yet to come on Saudi Arabia, because at the minute they're not fleeing, but there's a sense of crisis and growing crisis. There's actually talk, and you probably have heard this in recent days, of Saudi Arabia joining the war. At the minute they're being hit, it's like they're being punched in the face. They're trying to stop the punches by using interceptor missiles. The trouble is with that is that interceptor missiles cost an inordinate amount of money versus the drones that come in. A drone that comes in costs $35,000 on average. An interceptor missile costs between 15 and 20 million pounds. There's a limit to how much you can do this. And the military websites that you can look at say nobody will disclose how many interceptors they've got, because once you know how many interceptors a nation's got, you've only got to fire one extra and you're out of luck. So nobody knows. But what they're saying is they're burning through interceptor missiles at the greatest rate of knots in modern warfare, which then means at some point they could start getting through. And therefore we could end up with this fleeing that we talk about here.
What began as a war between Iran and the powerful duo of the United States and Israel is now spiraling across the region. Missiles are flying, drones are striking, and American bases are being targeted without pause. But in the middle of this expanding conflict stand the Arab nations not as spectators, but as targets. Despite sharing brotherly ties, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Jordan, and Iraq have all witnessed its fury. But after being struck by Iran, why are Arab countries not retaliating?
Well, they're not at the minute, but it could come. Now, I want to give you a summary slide of where we've got to, because we're about to move into some different territory. So here is a summary of all the things we've looked at. We started off looking at Iraq, did we not? And Saddam Hussein, who's saying that I am a latter-day Nebuchadnezzar, and all these nations are far off coming in, bringing terrible destruction. It isn't actually over. There's still prophecy within Isaiah 13 still to play out. All of these have got elements to it that still have got to reach a conclusion, but they've all begun in a sequence. So there is Isaiah 13. Then we moved on to look at Philistia, which is modern-day Gaza. And we saw that straight after the Iraq war, Hamas comes into power because Israel's backed out. And now the Hamas war is underway between Israel and the Gaza area and the Palestinians in general. And that all began in around about 2006, 2007. And on it's gone on and on and on. And it's still underway right now. Israel is hitting its nearby enemies in this inner ring war, as I call it. We then look at Sudan. Sudan, that's been having trouble for years upon years upon years, suddenly divides into a Muslim and Christian country. The newest country on earth is South Sudan. It's meant that the north is now entirely Muslim, and it's making deals with Russia exactly as we would expect. We then look at Syria. Syria in chapter 17, Sudan and Syria the wrong way around there in terms of the order. But Syria, we saw great conflict there, the removal of Assad and destruction around Damascus that has probably, I wouldn't say ever been seen before, but certainly scenes that we've never seen before. Still more to happen there. Damascus is going to get removed from being a city entirely at some point. We then look at Egypt, the uprising there. There's Egyptian fighting Egyptian, all started in 2011, and that brought the end of Hosni Mubarak's reign, but military leaders now come in and control Egypt. Then a few more years go back, and we're here right now. Remember, we said in Isaiah 13, it said when the Babylon-Iraq war begins, the Medes will be raised up. So the raising up of Iran started at the end of the Iraq war, and that's exactly what happened. They poured money into missiles, money into the proxy armies, and I think as a defensive measure to some extent to ensure that no Iraq scenario happened with them. But it's built up and built up and built up and built up to the point that now Iran is now in the sights and the war is underway, just as we've read in Isaiah 21, which all of that brings us to chapter 22. And chapter 22 starts off saying, the burden of the valley of vision. Oh no, we've got another burden that doesn't tell me what it is. Why can't it just tell me what it is? But in my Bible, I don't know if your Bible's got headings, but my Bible has the heading, simply says Jerusalem. Isn't that interesting? All these burdens, and now we get to the burden of Jerusalem. All of it's leading to Jerusalem, isn't it? Isn't Zechariah 14 all about all nations gathered against Jerusalem to battle? And here we have the burden of Jerusalem. We know it's all about Jerusalem because verse 9 says, you have seen also the breaches of the city of David that are many. You have numbered the houses of Jerusalem in verse 10. It is a day of trouble and treading down and of perplexity by the Lord God of hosts in verse 5. When you read the whole of this chapter, this is Jerusalem in a whole bunch of trouble. This is Zechariah 14. You know, in Zechariah 14, it talks about the nations coming in, and it says Jerusalem is well, what does it say? I was going to try and quote it, and I've had my brain's gone blank. It says something like the women are ravished and half the people go forth from one place to another. Let me just find it. Zechariah 14 says, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half the city goes into captivity, and so on. That is Isaiah 22. And look what's here in the middle of Isaiah 22. Elam bears the quiver. Elam is where? Iran. The quiver is a what? Missile. And so even in the conflict that is to come, that's specifically against Jerusalem, Iran's still there. Do you know something? We know Iran's still there because in Ezekiel 38, which is the alliance that comes against Israel, first on the list is Persia, and Persia is where? Iran. So allied to Russia is Iran. So what I've been saying is in the Weekly World Watch that whatever happens, somehow the regime survives. Or if it isn't this regime, it's one to be as so identical as to be it, because they're pro-Russian and anti-Israel at the very end, to the extent that they join forces with Russia to attack Jerusalem. And lo and behold, there they are here doing exactly that. So I've done a comparison. We're not going to go through all this now, between Isaiah 22 and Zechariah 14. I just read to you that verse from Zechariah 14 that talks about all nations coming against Jerusalem. There it is, look on the right. I will gather all nations against Jerusalem. There's all these attacks that come upon Jerusalem. And so I've gone through all these verses. On the left is Isaiah 22. On the right is Zechariah 14. It is Jerusalem actually losing. Jerusalem does not win the outer circle war when Russia comes down. How can a city be winning when half the city's gone off into captivity and the women are raped and ravished and the city has been brought to ruin? How the city hasn't won. They win the inner ring war, but they don't win this outer circle war. It's needing the intervention of God at this point by sending Jesus back, which is what Zechariah 14 tells you. There's one other thing in, I'll just quickly show you this. So in Isaiah, if we go back to Isaiah 22, I've lost my place here. So in Isaiah chapter 22, it mentions Eliakim. Can somebody find where it talks about Eliakim? I think it's near the end somewhere. Is it verse 20? Yes. It will come to pass in that day, I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with thy robe and strengthen him with thy girdle. And you say to yourself, well, I wonder who Eliakim was, because he was an ancient guy that lived a long time ago. In fact, he was second in command to Hezekiah. So Hezekiah was king of Israel, and Eliakim, it says, was over the house. In other words, he was the person in charge over everything that belonged to Hezekiah, second in command. And there's a lot of people who say, I'm sorry about the pictures of Jesus, I don't like doing that, but it generated it and I couldn't get rid of it. But anyway, Jesus on the right is a type of Eliakim on the left. I think this verse 20 here in Isaiah 22 is actually talking about Jesus himself, a type of Eliakim being set up over the house and ruling. In fact, it says in Isaiah 22 verse 22, I will place on his shoulder, this is Eliakim, the key of the house of David. And the only other place I can find where it talks about the key of the house of David is Revelation 3 verse 7, which is talking about Jesus who is holding the key of David. So that we've got Jesus being established here in Isaiah 22. Now, it almost feels that is the end of the story, doesn't it, to some extent, because you get to Isaiah 24, which is the final judgment of the world, which is really the wrap-up of all things. But there's this weird chapter that comes in between, because we're in 22, and then there's 24, which is the final judgment. That means there's a chapter in between. And the chapter in between, surprise, surprise, is Isaiah chapter 23. And you think to yourself, why is this chapter there? What comes after Jerusalem and Christ being established and obviously the overall judgment of the world? What's this? What's this? And if you notice, it says it's the burden of Tyre of all places. Why, after Jerusalem has now got Christ installed at the end of Isaiah chapter 22, why have we got another burden? And how is this linking to all of this? Is this a good question? Well, this is, I promise you, an hour-long talk on its own, which I'm now going to do in literally like 5 minutes. So I don't know how much of this is going to make a whole bunch of sense, because I do think this needs some slightly harder work. But this is the story. The burden of Tyre. Now, Tyre was originally the capital city of Phoenicia in ancient times, and it traded with the then known world. It's a city, even now Tyre is actually on the news quite a bit at the minute, because it's a city still in Lebanon. But back in the days of Isaiah, it was an incredible trading machine. It was the capital city of Phoenicia, traded with lots and lots and lots and lots of people. They turned anti-Jewish, and because of that, God brought the city of Tyre to an end. And there's a whole story about how that happened. And this chapter 23 tracks it. But there's a very interesting verse that talks about the end of Tyre, but something happens to Tyre. Do you want to know what happened to Tyre? Verse 6 tells you something happened to Tyre. Chapter 23 of Isaiah, verse 6 says, pass ye, Tyre, this capital city of Phoenicia, pass over to Tarshish. Now, I categorically do believe that Tarshish is Britain. You've only got to look in the passages in Ezekiel that say and explain who Tarshish is. Tarshish is Britain. Now, I'm just telling you that I can't give you all the evidence in 2 minutes that that's the case. So you're just going to have to perhaps take that one on the chin a bit, that Tarshish is Britain. So in other words, it's a capital city in Phoenicia that's trading with the world. They're setting up colonies. They're just traders. That's what they were. They got royalty that lived in Tyre as well. But Tyre comes to an end. But God says, actually, something happened. Tyre is going to pass over to Tarshish. But Tyre is a city. I mean, how would you pick up a city and move it to Britain? I mean, that's crazy. So it can't literally be brick by brick, Tyre's lifted up and people walk with bricks and rebuilt it in Britain. It's telling you that what happened in Tyre is going to be replicated in Britain. Tyre was the capital city of Phoenicia and traded with the then known world through colonies that it set up. It had a huge navy and basically formed its own empire through the colonies. And brothers and sisters, what happened in this country was exactly that, operating out of London, an empire that created colonies around the world and traded with pretty much all nations on the earth, not every nation on the earth, but a lot of nations on the earth. That is why God says Tyre is going to pass over to Tarshish. And so from verse 6 onwards, whenever it talks about Tyre, it's not talking about ancient Tyre anymore because it's passed to Tarshish. It's talking about the capital city of the country that we are living in right now, which is London, which was the city that ruled the empire. Which is why, when you get into this chapter, you eventually get to the bit, look, where it says, verse 14, howl ye ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste. This is all to do with the First and Second World War. It will come to pass that in that day, Tyre will be forgotten 70 years, according to the days of one king. So we're now looking for a royal ruler, because that's what the word king means. We're looking for a royal ruler that's living in London, latter-day Tyre, who rules for 70 years. Queen Elizabeth reigned from February the 6th, 1952, until her death on September the 8th, 2022, and her 70-year exact reign is the longest in British history. She is the ruler, I believe, that is spoken of here, and she ruled for 70 years. Exactly as it said, and actually many Christadelphians said this could be, before it even happened, what we might see happen. And lo and behold, it actually happened. But then look what happens. At the end of 70 years, the Lord will visit Tyre, and she, that's Tyre, this latter-day city based in Britain, she shall turn to her hire and shall commit fornication with the kingdoms of the world and upon the face of the earth. It actually says, look in verse 15, Tyre will be forgotten 70 years according to the days of one king, and at the end of 70 years, Tyre will sing as a harlot. Britain becomes like a harlot. Now, a harlot is a prostitute, and a prostitute in Bible terms is false religion. That's what it is. That's why in Revelation 17, it's a harlot that rides the beast, isn't it? And it's a woman, and she's got Babylon written on her head, and it's a false religion. So Britain is going to become like a false religion, a false harlot, after the Queen dies. And it doesn't take you very long to see that actually we're seeing these things happen. Tyre the harlot, a system of compromise we put there. After the end of 70 years, Tyre will sing as a harlot. These are astonishing pictures because this is the first time in let me read what it says in Wikipedia. King Charles III, praying with Pope Leo XIV in October 2025, was highly significant as the first British monarch to publicly pray with a pope in over 500 years. It marked a historic reconciliation following the Reformation era split between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church. The joint prayer in the Sistine Chapel occurred for the first time since Henry VIII broke away from Rome in 1534, marking a symbolic healing of a long-standing religious divide. But I don't think God sees it like that. Do you? But here's the thing, because where this gets to is the last verse here, because it then says, after Tyre has become like a harlot, it says her merchandise in verse 18, and her hire shall be holiness to the Lord. It shall not be treasured or laid up, for her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord. So in other words, some Tyre's wealth and what it stands for is given to God, is given to those who are in the future kingdom. Because look what it says, her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord. And I believe this is a direct reference to Psalm 72 verse 10, which says that the kings of Tarshish and of the isles will bring presents to Jesus. That's what it's referring to. And all kings will fall down before him. And it might not be King Charles on the throne. It could be somebody else. I don't know who it might be, because it depends on how much time goes on. But categorically, we're told that the kings of Tarshish are going to turn up to Jesus when he's here and give him gifts, give him presents. Now, what present could a king, do you think, give to Jesus? What present could he want? The crown. Now, Jesus doesn't need a crown out of the Tower of London, but symbolically handing over the kingship and the crownship and the rulership to Jesus is exactly the biggest gift that he or whoever is ruling in this country would give to Christ. To symbolically say, I'm no longer king. You are the king of the world. And those are the presents, I think, that are given. And that is why I think Isaiah 23 comes where it does, because Jesus is established in Isaiah 22 as the type of Eliakim. And at the end of this incredible chapter in Isaiah 23, this is handed over. The kingship is acknowledged by Tarshish and others as well, because it says all kings are going to fall down before Jesus. So when Jesus gets back, all kings will actually fall down before him. In fact, of course, in Zechariah chapter 14, it pretty much says exactly that, because it says that when Jesus' feet stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives splits in two and so on, it then says the Lord will be king over all the earth. And in that day, there'll be one Lord and his name one. So when Jesus gets back, he's not just going to be king over Israel. He's going to be a worldwide king. And if he's a worldwide king, it means you can't have a king of Britain and a king over all the world. You can't have two kings. There's never two kings. You're either a king or you're not a king. And one country can't have two kings. And if there's a worldwide rulership of King Jesus, then King Charles, or whoever it is that's in a king of this country at this point, has to lay his crown down at his feet. There's no other way around it, unless he wants to fight and say, I'm actually king, I'm going to fight against you, which it doesn't say he does. It says he brings presents, which then finally gets you into Isaiah chapter 24, which isn't the burden, but it's really God telling us what is coming on the earth during the time of all of these burdens. And as we've already looked at, it's a time of real big woe for the earth. I would say what Isaiah 24 is talking about is really the final push. You know, he talks about all the contractions. This is the push. This is the earth shaking. This is the financial collapse of the earth. This is few men left. This is a time of trouble such as never was. We might think we're in a time of trouble now. This is nothing to what's coming. It really is going to be horrendous. And that is why we need to be on board now. There is no earthly point hanging around to try and see Russia come down before you decide to do something about life. Now is the time to do something, because Jesus could return at any point between now and the next chapter. If we're in Isaiah 21, Isaiah 22 is the next chapter. Is it not? Which is Jerusalem. Now, I don't know how long it's going to take in terms of the verse count to get through the rest of Isaiah 21 and into 22. But the rate things are going, maybe not that long. Pretty much last slide is to say that there are 3 indictments of God about planet Earth in Isaiah 24. It says in verse 5 that the earth is also defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore the curse has devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men are left. The 3 indictments that God makes about mankind, and the reason that it ends up with Armageddon and destruction is because people have transgressed his laws. They have changed the ordinance. That means they've just made up their own rules. God said, here's the rules. People have made up their own rules, and they've broken the everlasting covenant. And that's all to do with Israel. The covenant it refers to there, the only time the phrase everlasting covenant's ever used is in relation to Israel. And God judges the world because of what ultimately the world does to Israel. The last thing I was going to say is, and I haven't really got a slide on this, but if you watch some of the YouTube talks, and not just from mine, but lots of other people as well, there is going to be a very short temporary time of false peace that's declared at some point. I know it's not in the burdens because God's just focused on the burdens here, but there's a time of very temporary false peace that is going to happen at some point between now and Jerusalem being invaded. And that's a whole other story, but I want to mention it because when it happens, you'll say you didn't mention that, so I'm mentioning it. So there's going to be a very, very short time of temporary peace that maybe Trump and others suddenly declare the Ukraine war sorted. Iran has, we've settled that. Israel's finished off Hamas and Hezbollah, and we can live confidently. And into that semi-peaceful temporary void, chapter 22 is going to happen. So hopefully you found all this interesting. They are the 10 burdens in Isaiah that to me is astounding to see them flowing as they have flowed before our eyes. And maybe it is for all of us to realize that the end of all things is at hand. Thank you for listening.